At over 843 acres, New York's Central Park is bigger than the entire country of Monaco. And while it looks like untouched wilderness, every hill, lake, and meadow was designed and built by hand. But the real story isn't on the surface, as beneath the lawns lie the remains of a lost village, the buried walls of a massive reservoir, and tunnels that sparked urban legends. In other words, below Central Park is an archaeological archive of relics that tell the story of New York City and its rise to prominence. So what's really under Central Park? Join me to find out. I'm your host Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. Let's head back to a time when the land that would eventually become Central Park was rugged, rocky, and sparsely settled. Before the Europeans arrived, the Lenape people called the island Mannahatta, meaning hilly island, for centuries. Its glacial outcroppings and natural springs were their hunting grounds and trading paths. But by the 17th century, Dutch settlers arrived and began reshaping the land. They built farms and hamlets, but the rocky, swampy center of Manhattan remained far less desirable. Even after the area fell into English control in 1664, much of what's now Central Park was still just open countryside, dotted with small settlements, stone walls, and roads like Kingsbridge Road, one of Manhattan's oldest routes. Fast forward to the early 1800s, and New York was exploding in size. In 1800, the city's population was just under 60,000, and by 1850, it had surged to more than 500,000, indicating a staggering rate of growth. Crowded tenements and factories filled lower Manhattan, and life for everyone was getting harder as waves of immigrants kept pouring into a city that lacked space. The ruling class, much included, needed fresh air and open space. And with that, reformers began calling for a great public park, something to rival the boulevards and pleasure grounds of cities like London or Paris. One of the loudest voices was William Cullen Bryant, the poet and editor of the New York Evening Post. In 1844, he argued that, quote, New York should build a park some miles distant from the dense parts of the city. A few years later, Andrew Jackson Downing, America's leading landscape gardener, reinforced the idea, pointing to European models like Hyde Park as inspiration and examples of what New York should follow. So it was. The city finally acted in 1853 when the New York State Legislature approved the creation of a Central Park. They initially designated about 775 acres between 59th and 106th, stretching from 5th Avenue to 8th. Though at the time, this was far north of the developed city. In fact, for the most part, what we now call Uptown was basically just wilderness. Anyhow, in 1857, the city held a design competition to shape the new park. Out of 33 submissions, the winners were Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux, with their so-called Greenwood's plan. Their design blended winding paths, rolling meadows, and tranquil lakes in a way that looked natural but was carefully staged. Every curve, every hill, every body of water was constructed. In other words, Central Park would be a man-made landscape disguised as wilderness. And with that, New York had its blueprint for a Central Park, a plan that effectively would set the standard of American landscape architecture. Though there was one extremely inconvenient problem. The land wasn't empty. Roughly 1,600 people already lived within what was to be the park's boundaries, including a thriving community called Seneca Village. By the early 1850s, the land between 59th and 106th Street was home to roughly 1,600 people. They weren't just clustered in one settlement, though. Rather, they were spread across rocky ground, small farms, and hamlets. The best known of these settlements was Seneca Village, on the west side between today's 82nd and 89th Streets. Founded in 1825, it grew into a community of about 225 to 300 residents by 1855, according to a census record compiled by the New York Historical Society. Now, most of these people were free black New Yorkers, meaning men, women, and families who were no longer enslaved after New York formally abolished slavery in 1827. Property ownership gave many of them something rare for the time: stability. Not to mention, in some cases, the right to vote, since New York law required black men to own at least $250 worth of property to cast their ballots. It was far more. It was a political and social foothold in a time when these two things were often denied. Now, I'm sure that many of you have heard about this settlement in other documentaries, and if you did, you might be very surprised to learn that according to the Central Park Conservatory, living alongside free black residents were also Irish and German immigrants, part of the same great wave of newcomers flooding into New York in the mid-19th century. It's a detail that's rarely told in the broader story. Many Irish families had fled famine in the 1840s, while Germans arrived after the failed revolution of 1848. And here's an interesting fact. In Seneca Village, records showed that some of these immigrants rented houses from black landowners, whereas others eventually bought small plots themselves. The result was a settlement that, while modest, was unusually diverse for its time. Churches of different denominations, a public school, and 2 burial grounds, all within a few blocks. And here's the thing. Traces of this lost village still remain under the park. In 2011, archaeologists dug small excavation pits at the site of former Seneca Village homes, where they unearthed small artifacts like an iron tea kettle, a roasting pan, a stoneware beer bottle, fragments of Chinese export porcelain, and a small child's shoe, complete with a leather sole and upper fabric portion. According to the Central Park Conservancy, these finds came from domestic contexts, kitchen refuse, yard features, and outbuildings. This was evidence of ordinary routine rather than a shantytown. Beyond that, you can still read parts of the old landscape at ground level. This is one of the least built sections of the park, where bedrock outcrops and the general ground surface mirror what the villagers walked on. There's also Tanner Spring, a water source that the community actually used, hence the namesake, even in modern day. And beyond that, documents and conservancy research confirm the social footprint here. So what we know for sure is that by the 1850s, about 50 homes stood in this place, along with 3 churches, a school, and 2 burial grounds. But what happened to those graves? Well, the record is murky at best. We know the park cleared buildings after 1857. Still, decades later, laborers digging a nearby tunnel turned up multiple coffins. Reports by the New York Herald on August the 11th, 1871, strongly suggest that not all burials were removed and that some of the resting places may actually still be accounted for beneath the modern park. But the story doesn't end here. Remember, Seneca Village only accounts for 300 of the 1,600 residents who were forced to vacate their homes and make way for the new park. Elsewhere, within what would become the park's future boundaries, stood other clusters, such as Irish shantytowns near McGowan's Pass in the north, small farms near York Hill, and scattered homesteads across the interior. Most of these enclaves were razed without a trace when the city acted through eminent domain. Anyhow, in 1853, once the state legislature approved the park, property owners were notified that their land was condemned. Some were paid, though many argued that their compensation undervalued the property. Others, especially renters, received nothing at all. By 1857, eviction orders were carried out. Families packed their belongings and moved to neighborhoods like Harlem or Staten Island's Sandy Ground community. And then, in some cases, they just left New York altogether and headed across the Hudson to New Jersey. And once they were gone, buildings were torn down, foundations pulled apart, and the land was cleared to make way for Greenwood's plan. So, with that land now cleared and traces of the old village left buried, the stage was set for another layer of history to rise and fall. One of the few structures left was a massive reservoir. Before we get to the reservoirs, let's do a quick recap of the timeline, because this part of the story can get confusing. So we know that Seneca Village was founded in 1825 along with what's now the west side of the park, near 82nd and 89th Street. Just 2 years later, in 1827, slavery was officially abolished in New York, and it didn't take long before the village grew as a foothold for free black property owners, who were eventually joined by lower-class European immigrants. Then, and this is a new point to the timeline, came 1842, when New York completed the Croton Aqueduct and built a massive receiving reservoir on the high ground between 79th and 86th. This put a massive waterworks right next to an already thriving community. So in 1853, when the legislature approved the creation of the park, both the village and this reservoir was swept into the park's future boundaries. And this is the point I wanted to clarify. Residents' homes were condemned. The reservoir, which was a highly critical piece of urban infrastructure, was not. The utility was a feature too important to lose. In fact, Olmsted and Vaux would later treat it as a part of the landscape, designing carriage drives and promenades that gave visitors sweeping views of its waters. For reference, this reservoir was needed to store water from the original Croton Aqueduct, which carried fresh water 41 miles from Westchester into Manhattan. Within the heart of Central Park, it was simply enormous, a vast rectangle that, according to some sources, was 1,826 feet long by 836 feet wide, enclosed by massive stone retaining walls. At full capacity, it held about 180 million gallons of water, and its elevation allowed gravity to feed clean water south into city pipes and fountains. Now, visually speaking, its sheer size and the embankments rising above the surrounding countryside gave it the look of a fortress. But the city just kept growing. Within just 20 years, the receiving reservoir wasn't nearly enough. Hence, the upper reservoir was completed in 1862, stretched over 100 acres, and can store up to 1 billion gallons of water. And surprisingly, it's still visible at the heart of the park today. Its Romanesque revival gatehouse, built of heavy masonry, are among the few original utility structures still standing above ground. Both reservoirs served the city well into the 20th century, but as new tunnels were built to bring water from further upstate, the old Croton system became redundant. The lower reservoir met its fate first. In the 1930s, the city drained it, filled it in, and transformed the space into the green lawn. The project took years, and much of the fill came from the excavation of Rockefeller Center, tying two of New York's greatest construction projects together in an unexpected way. By 1937, the Great Lawn opened to the public, its flat grass hiding the massive reservoir buried deep beneath. Now, the upper reservoir, by contrast, remained in service for decades longer. It was originally decommissioned in 1993, though its basin remains filled to this very day, and it stands as one of the park's most iconic features. So the question is, what's left below Central Park today? Well, one of the most intriguing and often overlooked gems is a manhole cover that dates back to 1862. Just off East Drive, where it intersects with 86th, there's a circular iron manhole lid stamped with the words Croton Aqueduct DPT 1862. This isn't just a random cover, as it sits atop a historic shaft lined with stone that leads down to a graded brick-lined tunnel. Local researchers believe that the tunnel itself runs to the South Gatehouse of the Kennedy Reservoir. According to Untapped New York and Beyond Central Park, this manhole was likely installed around the time the reservoir's South Gatehouse neared completion. So, like I said before, roughly mid-1862. It served a practical engineering purpose. Some period survey documentation and engineering reports described overwell well holes in gatehouses that connected to pipes and sewers in case the reservoir filled too high. The shaft under this manhole is likely a part of that drainage system. That being said, I should also point out that remains are not only limited to relics found below ground. Beneath the Central Park Police Station on 86th, the sloped stone embankment of the reservoir's northwest corner survives in plain sight, and the police station itself was initially a maintenance facility for the reservoir, and some of its interior walls are reported to have reused the original stone brick. Walk along the east side of the Great Lawn Oval, and you can still trace the rise of the reservoir's eastern retaining wall, hidden just under the turf. Whereas north of the Delacour Theater, rough stonework from the basin wall also exists, and occasionally can be seen through the trees. So, while you know the Great Lawn from picnics, concerts, and ball games, today, The ground beneath it is anything but empty. And just below all of that are even larger tunnels, including one that's large enough to drive a semi-truck through. And it still carries the city's lifeblood to this very day. One of the most critical arteries under the park is Water Tunnel number 3. Construction began in 1970 and has continued ever since, making it the longest-running capital project in New York City history. When all stages are finished, it will stretch over 60 miles. The Stage 1 section, which opened in 1998, passes directly under the park at about 78th and 5th Avenue. It's cut deep into the bedrock, between 250 and 800 feet below the surface. Furthermore, at some points, it's nearly 24 feet wide, large enough to drive a subway train through. There's also a valve chamber beneath 79th Street, hidden below the park, connecting the upper state water supply to Manhattan's distribution system. This chamber is part of the on-sea network that delivers nearly 1 billion gallons of drinking water to the city every day. And that's only the water supply. There's more. The 63rd Street Tunnel also runs beneath the park, carrying subway lines. To protect the surface, engineers bored this tunnel through solid rock, avoiding the cut-and-cover method typically used in New York. And you would never know this tunnel is there, as the only trace you might notice is near the Central Park Zoo, where the small ventilation grates are visible at ground level. And then there's the so-called Ghost Tunnel. Built in the 1970s as part of an early 2nd Avenue subway plan, it stretches between 57th Street and 7th Avenue, Lexington to 63rd. For decades, it went unseen. Hidden from most maps, it was a real tunnel, making it a type of urban legend. It's probably safe to say that from the very early days, the public felt a kind of allure with what might be hiding below the park. In the 19th century, one curiosity stood out: the Ramble Cave. It sat at the edge of the lake and was reached by a winding path that descended into the bedrock. Some sources suggest that it was officially open for tours. Accounts describe a shadowy chamber with rough stone walls, dripping water, and a cool draft that made it feel far more removed from the city just beyond the trees. Gas lamps lit the way, flickering against the damp rock as visitors stepped down into the darkness. But the cave gained a reputation for trouble. Park reports mentioned illicit activity, muggings, and even assaults taking place here. By the early 20th century, the Parks Department decided it was too dangerous to keep open, so the entrance was sealed, leaving only its memory in guidebooks and photographs. These days, the site of Ramble Cave still exists on the north shore of the lake, near Oak Bridge at 77th. You won't find any open passages though. The entrance is blocked, but the stone ledges and the terrain that framed it are still there, blending into the rugged landscape. And this is the very type of park feature that led to speculation and rumors. Those rumors have a way of multiplying. Take the so-called Tavern Tunnel. The story goes that a hidden passage once linked Tavern on the Green to the park interior for moving contraband during Prohibition. It's a great tale, and one that falls firmly into the unconfirmed category, though local guides, as well as enthusiasts, repeat it. The idea persists because the park really does have service corridors and basements where such things could plausibly fit. For example, near Rumsey Playfield, you'll hear about a vault beneath the summer storage grounds, or north in the park. Such was the case at the north end at Fort Clinton, when Conservancy staff cleared a historic cannon in 2013 and discovered it was still loaded with a cannonball and gunpowder, proof that the park's past, from an underground perspective, can literally sit unnoticed for centuries. And that's what's under Central Park. I hope you all enjoyed this episode, and if you did, you can let me know by clicking that subscribe button. Otherwise, until next time, I'm Ryan Socash, signing off.